So because Burr was Jefferson's first vice president, and thus a lot of these events took place during Jefferson's presidency, it's worth understanding what in the world happened that led to a duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Now, Burr had become a somewhat key player in Republican politics, but following the election of 1800, Jefferson's attitude towards him really began to cool after Burr refused to concede that particular election. Now, Jefferson really didn't have much to do with him, and Burr was actually upset when, early in his term as vice president, Jefferson refused to appoint one of his buddies to an important federal position. Now, the 12th Amendment is going to be ratified prior to the 1804 election, meaning that electors will cast separate votes for president and vice president. Back in 1800, that's what got us into trouble in the first place. You simply had 2 votes for president. That was it. So since Jefferson and Burr are both Republicans, they had technically tied. So now the votes for president and vice president are separate. And Jefferson had already chosen George Clinton of New York as his running mate. So Burr begins to turn his attention back to his home state of New York, where he's going to run for governor while he is still vice president. Now, obviously, Hamilton and Burr are going to be forever linked in American history. There's no getting around it. The ill feelings are going to begin when Burr unseated Hamilton's father-in-law for a New York Senate seat back in 1791. So their distrust of each other goes back over a decade. Now it kind of continues when Burr encourages New England secession following the Louisiana Purchase. He runs for governor of New York while still vice president when he knows Jefferson isn't going to choose him for his next VP. Hamilton, you can see Ham opposes. Yeah, he's not a fan of this at all. He uses his influence to decry him in New York newspapers. One thing leads to another. Burr writes him a letter and says, hey, take that back. Hamilton says, take what back? And Burr says, that negative thing you said about me. And Hamilton says, hey, I've said a lot of negative things about you the past decade. You're going to have to be a bit more specific than that. It really goes back and forth. But eventually, they agreed to an affair of honor, or a duel. Now, they agreed to duel at a site in Weehawken, New Jersey, because it was isolated and it was very hard to access. So that means it was a pretty popular spot for dueling. It was prearranged that Burr would arrive first at 7 a.m., along with his friend William Van Ness and one oarsman. Hamilton arrived with his second, his personal physician, David Hossack, Nathaniel Pendleton, and 2 other oarsmen. So this was actually called an interview. When they rowed each other back and forth, they called it an interview because dueling was illegal in New York. Now, they did cross the Hudson River to go into New Jersey. Dueling was illegal there, but the authorities kind of didn't care. They tended to look the other way. The 3 oarsmen were not allowed to watch, and the second for Hamilton turned his back. Hamilton is the one who was challenged, so he was allowed to select the weapons, which were custom-made pistols that Hamilton's son used in a duel at the same spot years earlier. Didn't turn out so well for Hamilton's son, which maybe should have been taken as a sign. Hamilton was allowed to choose his position. Each took the required 10 paces, and Pendleton would say the word present. Once he said present, each was free to fire. Now, what we know are that 2 shots were fired within a span of 4 to 5 seconds. The oarsmen who were listening down below, that's what they heard. That story's consistent. The end result was that Hamilton was mortally wounded, taken back to New York, where he died the next day. Now, reports indicate that Burr walked towards Hamilton after firing as if to say, are you okay? What have I done? But he was pulled back towards his boat. Days later, Burr took his seat as President of the Senate, as if nothing had happened. Now, eventually, New York won't prosecute because the fatal blow or the shot was fired in New Jersey. And New Jersey wouldn't prosecute because Hamilton died in New York. Now, here's where we see Burr goes crazy, so to speak. After the duel, he flees west and gets caught up in a scheme to possibly sell the West to Spain, or perhaps allow it to secede and form a separate nation. Which, yeah, this is treasonous. Eventually, he was found not guilty of treason because he had only talked about it and didn't follow through with it. He had already encouraged the possibility of New England secession because Federalists would lose their political standing from the Louisiana Purchase, and they had tried to recruit New York as part of the deal. So this kind of made him as, a little bit bigger threat. Now, when you look at the duel itself, really the best account of this duel comes from a book written in 2000 called Founding Brothers by a historian named Joseph J. Ellis. And really, when he ends that chapter on it, because it's a very well-written book, it looks at the duel in depth. In his opinion, the duel is going to be fought by two men that were on the outside looking in regarding national politics and America's future, and that history had pretty much passed them by. Hamilton still had influential friends, but he was out of office. Not really much chance of returning. His Federalist Party was kind of teetering on the edge. Burr was on the outs in federal politics, wasn't going to be vice president, didn't have many chances, so maybe it is indeed appropriate to say that history had pretty much passed them by.